On May 1969, a young American soldier named Barry Sadler sat in the back of an armored vehicle known as a MACV truck, crawling through the thick foliage of the Vietnamese jungle. As his vehicle made its way deeper into the green hell, he could hear the sounds of battle all around him. Suddenly, the tranquility was broken by a loud explosion, and the young soldier found himself tumbling through the air before everything went black. What had happened, and would this be where young Barry lost his life? Or would he survive to fight another day? This is the story of one of the bloodiest battles in the Vietnam War and one of the most dramatic stories of survival ever recorded. So the soldiers continued to move up the hill, taking heavy fire all the way. By May, the situation had become so dire that the US military decided to bring in reinforcements. It was at this point that Barry Sadler found himself on a MACV truck moving through the jungle towards Hamburger Hill. The fighting was intense and the casualties continued to mount. Despite the heavy losses, the order came down to hold the hill at all costs. So the US soldiers dug in and prepared for a long fight. Little did he know what was in store for him. He tied a makeshift tourniquet to his arm to stop the bleeding and tried to immobilize his shoulder with whatever materials he had at hand. He knew that this was just a temporary solution, but it would have to do until help arrived. Day after day, the fighting continued. The US soldiers fought bravely, but they were exhausted, hungry, and thirsty. As the hours passed, the situation became more and more dire. The enemy continued to launch attack after attack, but the Americans fought back bravely. He looked around and realized that he was surrounded by dead and wounded soldiers. Some were still moving, others were not so lucky. He called out for help, and soon enough, a group of soldiers came to his rescue. They were from the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, and they quickly rushed Barry back to the safety of the hill. His right arm had to be amputated below the elbow, and he would never be able to use it again. Barry was awarded the Purple Heart for his bravery and his sacrifice. But they were not able to reach Barry. The fighting was simply too intense and the risk of losing more lives was too high. They loaded him onto a helicopter to rush him to the nearest field hospital. At the hospital, Barry received the medical care that he desperately needed. The Battle of Hamburger Hill resulted in heavy casualties on both sides. The story of Barry Sadler is just one of many that emerged from the Vietnam War. It is a story of courage, resilience, and the will to survive. In the face of overwhelming odds, Barry refused to give up. He used his combat training to save his own life, and he never lost hope that he would be rescued. His story is a reminder of the human cost of war and the importance of honoring those who serve our country. In the end, the US military prevailed and captured Hamburger Hill, but at a great cost. Your support helps us continue producing quality videos that bring history to life. Over 200 US soldiers were killed and more than 1,000 were wounded. The enemy losses were even higher, but exact figures are unknown. The doctors worked quickly to stabilize his condition and save his life. Barry was left behind with the other wounded soldiers, hoping that he would somehow be rescued. He tried to build a shelter to protect himself from the elements, but the thick jungle foliage offered little protection from the heavy rain. He struggled through the dense undergrowth, pushing forward towards the sound of distant gunfire. He knew that the soldiers were still fighting on Hamburger Hill, and he hoped that he could find them and get medical attention. But the thick jungle foliage and the pouring rain made it almost impossible to navigate. Barry stumbled forward, driven by nothing but sheer willpower. Barry felt himself growing weaker and weaker, and he knew that he had to do something drastic. He wanted to survive. Barry began to search for help, calling out for medical assistance. The pain was unbearable, and he could feel himself slipping in and out of consciousness. He knew that he needed medical attention fast, but it didn't seem like any help was on the way. Just when he thought things couldn't get worse, the rain began to pour. But there was no response. He was on his own, and he knew that he had to take action fast. On May, the 2nd Battalion reached the summit of Hamburger Hill only to find that it was empty. It seemed like the enemy had vanished. However, this was just a trick. As he rode in the back of the MACV truck, suddenly there was a loud explosion and the vehicle lurched forward. Barry found himself thrown from the truck and tumbling through the air. When he came to, he realized that he had been seriously injured. His right arm was mangled and he could feel blood gushing from his wounds. He was in shock and in excruciating pain, but he knew that he had to get himself together if he wanted to survive. The US soldiers had walked right into another ambush. They were also low on ammunition. Things were not looking good for the Americans. But it all started long before Barry found himself hurtled through the air. The battle that Barry found himself in was known as the Battle of Hamburger Hill, or in military terms, Operation Apache. The operation took place between May and June 1969 in the Shao Valley in the northern part of South Vietnam. This was a mountainous region filled with deep valleys and thick jungle cover, which proved to be a perfect location for the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army to hide in and launch surprise attacks against the Americans. Hamburger Hill got its name from the hill that the US soldiers had to capture and hold. It was here that the bulk of the fighting occurred, and it became a symbol of the bloody and costly battles that were taking place in the region. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army had carefully planned their defenses, and they were ready to ambush the Americans at every turn. As soon as the first US soldiers set foot in the valley, the fighting began. The enemy opened fire from concealed positions, and the Americans were caught off guard. They quickly realized that they were in a serious situation. The US military had intelligence that suggested that there were large numbers of enemy troops and supplies in the area, so they decided to send in the big guns. Task Force Eager Beaver, consisting of the 2nd Battalion, 35th Infantry Regiment, 4th Battalion, 26th Infantry Regiment, and elements of the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment were sent in to flesh out the enemy. However, what the US soldiers didn't know was that they were walking right into a trap. But despite the heavy casualties, the order came down to push forward and capture Hamburger Hill, and as the days passed, the casualties mounted. As the fighting continued, the US soldiers continued to move up the hill, taking heavy fire from the enemy. The enemy opened fire from concealed positions, and once again the Americans were in trouble. It was during this time that Barry Sadler's life changed forever. With a mixture of adrenaline and sheer willpower, Barry managed to pull himself together. Using his combat training, Barry began to apply first aid to his wounds. Meanwhile, the fighting continued on Hamburger Hill. The US soldiers were holding on, but they were exhausted and in desperate need of supplies. Despite the intense fighting, medical evacuation helicopters were able to land and take the wounded soldiers off the hill. As the day wore on, Barry's condition began to deteriorate. Barry was soaked to the bone, and the cold combined with his injuries made him shiver uncontrollably. With his surge of adrenaline, Barry managed to get himself upright. Just when he thought he couldn't go on, he heard the sound of voices. Once the soldiers saw the state that Barry was in, they knew that he needed medical attention immediately. In the end, Barry survived, but he was permanently disabled due to the extent of his injuries. After recovering from his injuries, Barry returned home to the United States, where he lived the rest of his life a disabled veteran. The battle was controversial, and many people questioned the cost of such a Pyrrhic victory. The Battle for Hamburger Hill is a highly controversial battle from the Vietnam War. The order to assault the hill was given despite the fact that it was almost certain to result in heavy casualties. In this video, we're going to look at why the infantry attack was chosen over other options, why the attack was ordered, and finally, if the battle was worth it. On May 1969, a company of South Vietnamese paratroopers was sent to secure the top of a small hill near the Cambodian border. Company A would go right, Company B would go left, and Company C, under the command of Captain Ernest L. Medina, would go straight up the middle. Each company was to establish its own command post at the top. When it was over, only 166 men of the 800-strong battalion were able to report back fit for duty. Some 350 were wounded and 280 were listed as missing in action. Of those that survived, many were suffering from exhaustion and malaria. Air strikes and artillery barrages couldn't dislodge the entrenched enemy, and sending tanks or armored cars to support the beleaguered Vietnamese was impossible due to the thick jungle cover. What happened to them after the battle? Well, those that survived were awarded medals for their bravery. Some believe that the battle was a necessary and vital part of the war effort, while others believe that it was a pointless display of American arrogance that resulted in the loss of many good men. What do you think? Was Hamburger Hill worth it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Harold Moore was promoted to Brigadier General and Joseph Galloway was awarded a Bronze Star for his actions during the battle. However, many of the men who had taken part in the battle later suffered from physical and mental health issues. This was due to a combination of factors including the physical wounds that they had sustained, the psychological trauma of the battle, and the fact that they had been given such a dangerous mission with virtually no chance of success. In addition, the men felt that they had been abandoned by their government, which had refused to acknowledge the true cost of the battle. As a result, many of the men turned to alcohol and drugs to help them cope with their injuries and their memories. Others attempted to take their own lives. It wasn't until many years later that the government began to provide the men with the medical care and financial assistance that they needed. Infantry was the only way to go, but why was the attack ordered in the first place? Well, this is where things start to get murky. General Samuel Coster, the general responsible for ordering the attack, said that he had no option but to relieve the South Vietnamese. He said the order to relieve them was not an order to do anything rash. It was an order to accomplish a mission which was essential to the safety of the Vietnamese and the success of our efforts in the war. However, this was disputed by some of his officers, particularly the commander of the 1st Brigade, whose men were not deployed during the battle. These officers felt that the risks were too high and that other options should have been explored. They also felt that once it became apparent that there was no enemy on the hill, the attack should have been stopped. Only 4 North Vietnamese soldiers were taken prisoner. The rest of the dead were given a quick check for signs of life before being buried. It did, however, make a number of recommendations to improve future operations. One of these was the establishment of a special operations unit that would be tasked with conducting reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines. This would allow commanders to gather intelligence on the situation without having to commit large numbers of troops. Another recommendation was the development of new tactics that would allow infantry units to operate more effectively in heavily forested areas. This was in response to the thick jungle that had hampered the relief forces' efforts. Finally, the investigation recommended that all units be equipped with night vision devices, which would have allowed them to continue the attack after dark without suffering the heavy casualties that had occurred during the early morning hours. Those that showed any signs of life were evacuated to field hospitals. The South Vietnamese company that originally held the hill barely had a man left at this point. Out of the 247 men, only 185 were still alive. Once the Americans got closer to the hill, they came under heavy fire. The media pointed out that hundreds of American men had died to capture a hill that wasn't even fully manned by the enemy. It was claimed that this was yet another example of pointless American involvement in the war. Senator Robert Kennedy called the battle tragic, adding, "I can't understand why it was necessary for 200 young American boys to die to take a hill that was virtually unoccupied." Following this, a book was written about the battle called We Were Soldiers Once, and young by Lieutenant General Harold G. Moore and journalist Joseph L. Galloway. This contained first-hand accounts from both sides. It further emphasized just how costly the battle was and asked whether it was worth it. Company A was pinned down immediately. They tried to move out again, but were forced to take cover after suffering several casualties. This happened repeatedly for 2 days. If we put aside the political implications of the battle and focus solely on the military ones, then yes, it was absolutely worth it. You see, Hamburger Hill was important for two reasons. First, it gave the Americans a dominating position over the surrounding area. From here, they could keep watch over the tracks used by the North Vietnamese to resupply their forces in the area. Second, taking the hill was a morale booster for the South Vietnamese. It demonstrated that the Americans were willing to fight for them and that they would be relieved when in critical situations. Without this support, the ARVN might have broken and fled, which would have had disastrous consequences for the overall war effort. Meanwhile, Company B suffered similar setbacks. As for Company C, they fared a bit better. They did have to contend with several enemy positions, but they managed to clear them all away. However, when they got close to the top, they were once again forced to take cover. This time, though, they were out of ammo and low on water and food. So when Captain Medina radioed headquarters asking for permission to postpone the attack until nightfall, he received the reply, "No, we need Hill 937 now." His lieutenant, William K. Wofford, later recalled, "It was my understanding that we had to take the hill at all costs. If that meant everybody had to die trying to get to the top, then that's what happened." Medina himself said that he was never given any option of not attacking. The hill was known by the Americans as Hamburger Hill because the GIS stationed there reminded the officers of ground chuck while they were sitting on the hill. At 17:30 hours, they resumed their attack and fought through the darkness against a backdrop of heavy rain. Just before reaching the summit, they encountered the last major obstacle, an enemy machine gun nest. The position was manned by 5 North Vietnamese soldiers. All 5 were killed, but not before they inflicted serious casualties on the Americans. This was the last major engagement of the battle. With their main obstacles cleared, the men of Company C reached the top of the hill. There they found the remains of those who had defended the hill. Over 200 dead North Vietnamese soldiers littered the summit, but there were also dozens of empty bunkers, suggesting that the enemy had retreated rather than being wiped out. The Vietnamese called it simply Hill 937. By late afternoon, the company had secured the summit. But then suddenly the NVA launched a massive counterattack with waves of soldiers attacking the hill from all sides. This continued throughout the night, and when dawn broke, it turned out that the Vietnamese company was completely surrounded. It had suffered 40 dead and more than 60 wounded and was completely out of ammunition. They were holding on by a thread. After assessing the situation, the commander of the 23rd Infantry Division, General Samuel Coster, decided to mount an all-out assault to relieve the besieged Vietnamese. He chose to do this with the 1st Battalion of the 5th Cavalry Regiment. The battalion consisted of 3 companies and roughly 800 men. Its commanding officer was Lieutenant Colonel Harold G. Moore. On May, the day before the relief attempt, the men were told that their mission was to seize Hill 937, which was still occupied by enemy troops, no matter how long it took. They would be supported by airstrikes and artillery, but no armored vehicles or helicopters were allowed. So the men had to carry everything themselves, including their heavy equipment like recoilless rifles and anti-tank weapons. They also had to carry all of their supplies like food and water. Because of the dense jungle, this made little difference to the men. After all, they had been fighting in such conditions for weeks. The mission briefed to them was to go to the hill and capture it. No specific plan was given as to how to do so. This is partly because there wasn't one and partly because time was of the essence. The besieged Vietnamese needed help and quickly. When they reached the base of the hill, they split into 3. And so they waited until dark before continuing their advance. In total, the battle lasted 3 days and nights. When news of the battle reached the US, it caused a media sensation. So let's answer the question, was taking Hamburger Hill worth it? As for why the infantry attack was chosen over other options, well, there was no other option. Despite these claims, the official investigation into the battle found no wrongdoing on the part of General Custer. But what about the men? Today, we are going to talk about an extremely dangerous mission that was conducted by the ARVN-2, 3rd Battalion in the early morning hours of June 1968 during Operation Patton-S Hammer, and how the outcome of this assault would influence the final outcome of the Battle of FSB-48. Their mission was to relieve beleaguered elements of the ARVN-2, 3rd Battalion, who had been holding out at Firebase 48 or FSB-48 for almost a week with very little supplies and under constant enemy attack. The NVA had launched a massive attack against the base earlier in the day and were now only 100 yards from the wire. Meanwhile, 1st and 2nd Platoon of Charlie Company began their march toward Hill 879. The return fire from 1st Platoon alerted the NVA that someone was in the area. The enemy quickly shifted his attention from the beleaguered troops on Hill 879 to the oncoming reinforcements. The NVA had fled, leaving behind their dead and wounded and several weapons. All they could see was a large column of smoke rising in the distance. They couldn't tell if the NVA was retreating or if they were planning another attack. But they did know one thing: they couldn't stay on the hill much longer. They had been in a desperate situation on Hill 881, but they had refused to give up. They had fought back against the NVA and had inflicted a major defeat on them. Also remember to subscribe to my channel, you haven't already, so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching. This victory was a major boost to the morale of the ARVN. It showed them that they were capable of holding their ground against the NVA and that they could win. This victory was also a blow to the NVA. It showed that the ARVN was not the weak force that the NVA had thought it was. The NVA had underestimated the ARVN and had paid the price. They had accomplished their mission of relieving the soldiers on Hill 879, but they were now in a precarious position themselves. But the ARVN had won a major victory on Hill 881, and this victory would help them to hold out until relief could arrive. The battle for FSB-48 was an important one. It was a battle between two evenly matched opponents. The NVA was a strong, determined force that was fighting on its home turf. The ARVN was a weaker force that was fighting against a determined enemy on an unfamiliar terrain. The NVA had the advantage in numbers and firepower. The ARVN had the advantage in training and experience. The NVA won the first battle, but the ARVN won the war. If the NVA decided to come back and attack, they would be sitting ducks, so they made camp for the night and waited for the cavalry to relieve them. The soldiers quickly moved to secure the area and began to collect the abandoned weapons. As the sun rose, the soldiers on Hill 881 could see the true extent of the damage that had been inflicted on the NVA. The entire operation had been a success. Not only had they relieved the soldiers on Hill 879, but they had also inflicted a major defeat on the NVA. During the battle, Charlie Company had suffered 13 killed and 31 wounded. Of the 200 soldiers on Hill 881, 1st Platoon had suffered 6 killed and 15 wounded, while 2nd Platoon had suffered 7 killed and 16 wounded. Despite their heavy casualties, the soldiers of Charlie Company had fought bravely and had been successful in their mission. There were dead and wounded everywhere. The NVA had suffered a major defeat. The soldiers quickly began to search the area for any additional weapons or ammunition they could find. They also began to collect the dead and wounded NVA soldiers so they could be evacuated. Among the weapons they found were 2 recoilless rifles, 2 machine guns, and several light machine guns. They also found 150 rounds of 12.7mm ammunition, 26 grenades, and a large quantity of small arms ammunition. In addition, they found a medical kit and several documents. Just as the fight was starting to heat up, the fog suddenly dissipated. The NVA fighters quickly took advantage of this and pressed their attack. They opened up with everything they had, including small arms, recoilless rifles, and machine guns. Unfortunately, the thick foliage prevented the defenders from returning effective fire. This caused the NVA fighters to shift their positions and mass on the ridge crest, exposing themselves to the defenders on Hill 881. Seeing this, the defenders took advantage and laid down accurate small arms fire, inflicting casualties on the NVA while forcing them back into the thick undergrowth. The plan called for 1st Platoon to lead the way, followed by 2nd Platoon and then the company headquarters. As the fight intensified, both sides realized that they were dealing with each other, so the order was given to cease fire. Negotiations were attempted, but these fell apart when the NVA refused to surrender their prisoners and demanded the release of their own. Realizing that they weren't going to get the NVA to negotiate, the decision was made to renew the attack. A massive artillery and mortar barrage was laid down on the NVA position, followed by a helicopter gunship attack. Then the soldiers on Hill 881 delivered a final volley of small arms fire. After that, silence fell over the hill. The NVA had been defeated. 1st Platoon moved out first, followed closely by 2nd Platoon. The two platoons kept a distance from each other to avoid friendly casualties from their supporting arms. Additionally, since the fog limited visibility, movement was slow and difficult. The troopers had to literally feel their way through the thick foliage and dense undergrowth. They were hammering the base with mortar and rockets, making any type of resupply attempt extremely dangerous. So it was decided that the best course of action would be to conduct an assault across the 3 miles of rough terrain separating the two hills and link up with the beleaguered troops on Hill 879. To cover this assault, a thick fog was covering the area, which provided some much-needed concealment from prying NVA eyes. However, it would also limit visibility for the troops conducting the assault. But it was deemed better to have limited visibility than none at all. So orders were given to commence the attack. The previous 5 days saw heavy fighting around the base. And on one occasion, the NVA even penetrated inside the wire where they engaged in hand-to-hand fighting with the ARVN troops manning the base. At one point, only 2 companies of the battalion remained intact, with the 1st and 2nd Platoons of Charlie Company holding out on Hill 881 with approximately 200 men. Meanwhile, the 3rd Platoon along with the headquarters company were holding out on Hill 879 to the north of them with about 275 men. They were low on just about everything, especially ammunition. And they were hoping that the cavalry could relieve them before their ammunition supply ran out. This is the story of Charlie Company's attack on Hill 881. On the evening of June 1968, elements of 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry Regiment were conducting an air assault into landing Zone X-ray near the Cambodian border. But there was a problem. At 1800 hours, 2 companies of the 5th Cavalry departed LZ X-ray in helicopters to provide covering fire for the assault. About 15 minutes into the march, 1st Platoon came under fire from an NVA machine gun and immediately returned fire. Meanwhile, on Hill 879, the defenders manned their positions and awaited the relief force. As the smoke cleared, the soldiers on Hill 881 could see the effect of the artillery barrage and the helicopter gunships. The soldiers then moved to the edge of the hill to look for any sign of the NVA. At 0600 hours on June, the cavalry arrived to relieve the exhausted troopers of Charlie Company. By 0800 hours, the relief force had taken over Hill 881 and the soldiers of Charlie Company were beginning to make their way back to their base. After the battle, the soldiers of Charlie Company were praised for their bravery and their tenacity. The battle for FSB 48 was far from over. In fact, the NVA would launch one last major attack against the firebase. Hi everyone, it's me, welcome to my channel. Thank you for joining me today. Today, we're going to talk about Hamburger Hill and the media's influence on the American public's perception of it. Now before we get started, I just want to remind everybody that this is a sensitive topic. There are people who have lost their lives or suffered severe injuries during the battle, so let's keep things respectful. Let's keep politics out of this and just focus on the battle itself. Okay, thank you. So Hamburger Hill, that name conjures up all sorts of thoughts and feelings depending on when you were around for it and what your experience with it was. But what does that name even mean, and how did the media come up with it? It told the story of a helicopter assault on the hill by elements of the 23rd Infantry Division. The article described the fierce resistance the soldiers encountered and the high number of casualties. It stated that the Americans had suffered heavy losses with more than 100 dead and 200 wounded. The tone of the article was matter-of-fact, and it focused on the logistics of the battle rather than its political implications. This editorial discussed the political implications of the battle and the broader war in Vietnam. Overall, the articles were relatively neutral and focused on the facts of the battle rather than injecting political bias. For example, the articles mentioned the high casualty rates among both sides and the difficulties of retrieving the bodies of those who had been killed. They also acknowledged the bravery of the soldiers involved in the fighting. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. I will do my best to answer them. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching. Have a safe and wonderful day. It argued that the war was unwinnable and that the United States should begin withdrawing from Vietnam as soon as possible. The editorial expressed frustration with the Johnson and Nixon administrations for failing to set clear goals for the war and for continuing to escalate American involvement despite the lack of progress. The hill itself was called Hill 877, and it was so because that's what it was labeled on the maps. This article also described the events of May, but took a slightly different approach. For example, the use of loaded language such as costly and unwinnable suggested that the war was not worth the human cost. As you can see, the media's coverage of the Battle of Hamburger Hill was relatively neutral and factual, but it also reflected the growing anti-war sentiment in the United States. The articles provided a detailed account of the battle and the toll it took on American soldiers. They also acknowledged the bravery of the soldiers involved in the fighting, but they also used loaded language and editorials to criticize the war and call for American withdrawal from Vietnam. Additionally, editorials such as the one published by the Washington Post on June 10th openly called for the United States to withdraw from Vietnam. This indicated that the media was playing a role in shaping public opinion on the war. This article focused on the aftermath of the battle and the efforts to recover the bodies of those who had been killed. This article provided a brief overview of the battle and highlighted the capture of Hill 877 by American forces. However, it also mentioned that the fighting had been costly in terms of American lives. This article struck a balance between reporting the facts of the battle and acknowledging the human cost of war. It discussed the difficulties of retrieving the bodies due to the ongoing threat of enemy fire and the emotional toll it was taking on the soldiers involved. The article humanized the battle by focusing on the personal experiences of the soldiers, something the New York Times would continue to do throughout the conflict. It emphasized the bravery of the soldiers and the determination of the North Vietnamese army. The article also mentioned the high casualty rates among both sides and noted that the fighting was some of the heaviest since the Tet Offensive. Overall, the article presented a balanced view of the battle, acknowledging the bravery of both sides while also highlighting the heavy toll the fighting was taking on American forces. It wasn't really Hamburger Hill until it got into the newspapers. The battles for this hill raged from May to June 1969 and were fought between elements of the U.S. Army's 23rd Infantry Division and the North Vietnamese Army. The hill was situated near the border of South Vietnam's Binh Long province back then. There were only 3 television networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS. Cable TV didn't become popular until later. In addition, there were 24-hour news channels and most of the major newspapers were still independently owned. This meant that the national media landscape was relatively small compared to today. And the US wanted it because it would give them a better vantage point from which to observe the surrounding terrain. These 4 newspapers were selected because they were some of the most widely read in the country at the time. They also felt that if they had it, the Viet Cong would not be able to use the surrounding area to stage attacks on the U.S. Marines to the south. so it was deemed an important strategic objective. To understand the media's influence on the public's perception of the battle, it helps to know what the media was like at the time. In order to gauge how the public felt about the battle, I looked at articles that were published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, and the Chicago Tribune. On May 10, 1969, the New York Times published an article titled "Heavy U.S. Casualties on Hillside in Vietnam." That same day, the Washington Post published a similar article titled "G is Take Hill After Costly Battle." The next day, May 11th, the New York Times published a follow-up article titled "Search for Missing Continues After Hill Fighting." On June, the Los Angeles Times published an article titled "U.S. Captures Hill 877 from Reds." On June, the Washington Post published an editorial titled "The Price of Hill 877." These articles demonstrate how the media covered the Battle of Hamburger Hill, both in terms of the level of detail provided and the perspective taken. However, there were subtle ways in which the articles reflected the growing anti-war sentiment in the United States. As the war dragged on and casualty rates continued to rise, the media's coverage became more critical of the war, and its coverage of battles, such as Hamburger Hill, began to reflect this anti-war sentiment. I hope this has been helpful in understanding the media's influence on the American public's perception of Hamburger Hill. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode. Today, we are going to be talking about the battle for Hill 937, or commonly referred to as just Hill 937. This was a very bloody battle. The statistics that I'm about to show you are going to shock you. And I actually did a video on the Battle of Churwan, which was right next to this hill, and so I talked about this a little bit. But the reason why I am doing a separate video on this hill is because it was just so bloody, and they were supported by tanks from the 65th Tank Battalion. And their goal was to take Hill 937, which was occupied by Chinese forces. The Chinese had built several field fortifications around the hill, including trenches, bunkers, caves, and anti-tank ditches. And they had mined the approaches to the hill. They came out of their holes and started throwing grenades. Everyone was yelling and making lots of noise. Men fell all around me dead and wounded. The surviving Americans fell back to their original positions, and the Chinese launched a counterattack, overrunning Hill 120 and pushing the Americans off of Hillary. By nightfall, the Chinese had taken over most of Hill 937. Now, before I get into this, I just want to say thank you to all of my supporters. They had 213 total casualties. The Chinese had 340 casualties, so again, the Chinese were winning. He immediately ordered his engineers to clear another route up the hill, and he planned a new attack for 1800 hours. That's a total of 165, and the Chinese had 330 for casualties. It involved the 2nd Battalion, 27th Infantry, the 1st Battalion, 35th Infantry, a company from the 58th Ordnance Heavy Mortar Company, an 81mm mortar platoon, and a medical aid station. A heavy volume of artillery fire was placed on the hill just before the attack, so this was not looking good for the Americans. They had lost 165 men for literally no gain. However, the soldiers who attacked up the center of the hill said that they could hear the men to their right and left being cut down by the defenders. Most of them were knocked out, but the infantry managed to reach the summit of the hill and secure it. 25% of those were stateside. That means that 275 men were wounded or injured but still able to return to duty. All that we know is that they had 1,400 total casualties. So between 27th of April and the 10th of May, 86 United States service members died trying to capture this hill, and thousands more were wounded. And 86 of the men were killed in action. During the third attack, the United States suffered 176 total casualties. The Chinese suffered 527 casualties. I hope that you learned something from this video. If you did, please subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you to all my supporters. I really appreciate it, and I will see you next time. Of the 6 tanks that were supporting this attack, 4 were knocked out and 2 broke down. The attack ended in failure. And this was just one small part of the overall Battle of Chorwan, which itself was just a small part of the Korean War. Only 150 yards of Hill 937 had been captured and the United Nations had taken 511 casualties. It wasn't until their 3rd attempt when they finally managed to capture and hold the hill. One American sergeant said that it was the bloodiest hill that he had ever seen. Hill 937 changed hands several times during the next few weeks. But by mid-May, control of the hill was firmly in United Nations hands. The survivors withdrew to their original positions and they were harassed all the way back by Chinese mortar and small arms fire. One soldier wrote, "It seemed as though every man on our right was killed. Our platoon jumped off in a charge up the hill. There was nothing more to do. We went through a withering fire and many men were hit. I saw some fall and others drag themselves behind rocks, and there were also 3 anti-tank ditches in front of the actual main trench line." This assault force consisted of elements of the 2nd Battalion, 27th Infantry, the 1st Battalion, 35th Infantry, a platoon from the 58th Ordnance Heavy Mortar Company, an 81mm mortar platoon, and an engineer platoon. Their plan was to use tanks to cross the anti-tank ditch and drive down the slopes and destroy the enemy as field fortifications. But as they crossed the anti-tank ditches, 4 of the 5 tanks were knocked out. Then the Americans advanced on foot and they faced fierce resistance from the Chinese who were dug into their fortifications. The Americans suffered heavy casualties. The first attack against Hill 937 by United Nations Command was on April, so this was just one day after the Battle of Kapyong, where the Turks defended against Chinese forces. You guys have been amazing and I really appreciate it. Alright, let's get into it. So as you can see here, Hill 937 is located in Korea. Now this photo doesn't do it justice, but the entire front side of this hill was basically covered in barbed wire. And at this time, it was the 2nd Battalion, 27th Infantry Regiment of the 25th Infantry Division. The American battalion had 3 companies deployed along a 2-mile front with only 1 platoon. In reserve, 2 of the companies were deployed on Hill Erie, which was west of Hill 937, while the 3rd company was placed on Hill 120, which was east of the 937. Each company had 1 platoon in the front and 1 platoon in reserve. There were no artillery observers with the ground units. All that they had was an 81mm mortar platoon. On the morning of April, the Americans began moving towards the hill. One soldier wrote, "We went up that hill. We couldn't go any further. The enemy had us surrounded." So here's what the casualty report looked like. The Americans had 4 officers and 161 enlisted men casualties. On April the 5th, Regimental Combat Team 27 returned to Hillary to try to retake the hill. At the same time, the 1st Battalion 35th Infantry attacked across the central portion of Hill 937. Their orders were to take Hill 937 at all cost. American tanks were again used to cross the anti-tank ditches and support the infantry. But once again, the majority of the tanks were knocked out. During the second attack, the United States suffered even heavier casualties than they did in the first. In the afternoon, Colonel Henry T. King of the 27th Infantry took over command of the U.S. troops on the ground. That night, a 3rd attack was launched. 2 routes up the hill were then cleared by tanks and the infantry followed. But once again, the tanks were stopped by the anti-tank ditches. Throughout the night, Chinese reinforcements tried to retake the hill. And until 06:00 on April, the Americans defended their position against repeated attacks. When the smoke cleared, the United Nations had taken the hill. But the fighting had not been worth the price. What makes this battle especially unique is the fact that the United Nations had 3 attempts to capture this hill, and they almost failed every single time. By the end of the battle, Hill 937 was a mass grave. Soldiers from both sides were lying on the hill and in the surrounding area. Here are the total casualties for the entire Battle of Hill 937. For the United Nations, they had 1,100 total casualties. For the Chinese, we don't know how many KIA they had. And the crazy thing about this is that Hill 937 was never really that important. It didn't really have any major strategic value, it was more so symbolic. But these men fought and died on this hill, and they deserve to be remembered.